The sun was beginning to set over Tokyo's Haneda Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling runway. It was 6:10 p.m., and Japan Airlines Flight 123 was ready for departure. The plane's engines roared to life, a familiar hum that signaled the beginning of yet another routine flight. In the left-hand seat sat First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, a 39-year-old pilot training to become a 747 captain. His hands rested confidently on the controls as he exchanged a brief nod with Captain Masami Takahama, a seasoned pilot with 20 years of experience, including time as a military aviator. Takahama, calm and composed, instructed Sasaki to handle the radios while he took charge of the flight itself. The flight plan called for a right turn shortly after takeoff, marking the beginning of their journey. The cockpit was a space of quiet focus as the crew communicated with ground control, ensuring their departure was clear. The air was thick with the anticipation of another routine flight. However, as the Japan Air 123 prepared to taxi, the excitement and the sense of normalcy started to shift. The Auburn holiday was approaching, a Buddhist tradition that brought families together from across Japan. For many passengers, this flight was more than just a journey. It was a reunion, a return to familiar places and loved ones. Among them was Yumi Ochi, a 26-year-old off-duty flight attendant, relieved to have a break from her busy schedule. Yumi was like many young Japanese who dreamed of seeing the world, and her job with Japan Airlines had made that dream a reality. As Flight 23 lifted off, the crew adjusted to the familiar rhythms of flight. The iconic 747 soared into the sky, still one of the most recognized and beloved aircraft in aviation history. Its origins, dating back to the 1970s, symbolized progress and the golden age of air travel. The 747's spacious design and powerful engines made it a symbol of Japan's growing aviation prowess. The Ministry of Transportation kept a watchful eye on the flight, ensuring smooth operations and providing the crew with any necessary guidance. Within the cockpit, the crew fell into a comfortable routine. Flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, who had been flying the 747 since its introduction, monitored the instruments, keeping the aircraft steady and on course. Back then, these aircraft required 3 pilots, a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer to manage the numerous systems. But tonight, the flight was proceeding smoothly until suddenly everything changed. At cruising altitude, 24,000 feet above the ground, Flight 123 encountered a mysterious and sudden force. In the blink of an eye, the autopilot disengaged, throwing the pilots into action. The unsettling sound of an explosion echoed through the cockpit, a sound that no pilot wanted to hear. Panic set in as they struggled to regain control of the aircraft. Yutaka and Masami quickly communicated, attempting to diagnose the problem. The captain called out, "Something exploded," as they began broadcasting an urgent situation, squawking 7700 on the transponder, signaling a serious emergency. As they assessed the damage, the crew noticed a significant drop in cabin pressure. A catastrophic depressurization was underway. At this altitude, any loss of oxygen became a deadly threat. Instinctively, they instructed passengers to put on their oxygen masks and fasten their seatbelts. The emergency masks provided only 15 minutes of oxygen, just enough for an emergency descent. The cockpit became a blur of tense commands and quick reactions as the crew worked tirelessly to stabilize the aircraft. With seconds ticking away, the captain ordered a sharp right turn, guiding the plane back toward Haneda. The familiar outlines of Tokyo came into view, a reassuring sight amidst the chaos. Flight 123 was now 70 miles behind its intended destination, but the crew had one clear mission: to get back to the airport safely. The story of Flight 123 was now far from ordinary. The pilots, First Officer Sasaki and Captain Takahama, faced a life-threatening crisis that tested their training and resilience. As they worked together, navigating the turbulence of both the flight and their own fears, the world watched, unsure of what would come next. The air inside the cabin had grown tense and suffocating. The pilots of Japan Airlines Flight 123 had been grappling with the unrelenting struggle of trying to control their aircraft for nearly 14 minutes. The aircraft had inexplicably refused to descend despite all their desperate attempts. The R5 door, broken and useless, had only exacerbated their mounting troubles. The hydraulic pressure had dropped dramatically, leaving the crew with no means to maneuver the control surfaces. The first officer's control inputs felt futile as the plane stubbornly refused to respond. There was no manual, no procedure to guide them through this terrifying scenario of complete hydraulic failure. In the cockpit, silence was punctuated by moments of sheer disbelief. The captain's hands trembled as they desperately tried to bring the aircraft under control. But nothing worked. The once familiar instruments and routines had become alien, leaving them blind to their own fate. Even as they struggled to comprehend the loss of pitch and elevator control, the plane oscillated violently, rising and falling with no predictability. At that critical juncture, the decision was made to attempt engine power manipulation. One side powered down and the other increased, hoping for some form of control. Miraculously, it worked, though the adjustments were far from precise. The aircraft began a slow turn to the right, but any sense of relief was short-lived. The pilots pushed forward, still struggling to maintain control, unsure whether their efforts were enough. The crew could only cling to desperate hope as they reduced altitude, fighting the overwhelming urge to abandon their attempt and return to Haneda, familiar yet distant. Despite the worsening situation, they clung to the familiar path, desperate for stability, despite the worsening erratic behavior of the plane. In the cabin, oxygen masks hung dangerously low, and the passengers, now gasping for breath, began to panic. The passengers couldn't fathom the depth of the crew's struggle, as they could only witness their descent into uncertainty. The aircraft was no longer flying as it should. The once simple act of lowering the landing gear became a desperate maneuver to add drag and slow the descent. But even this didn't provide the relief they so desperately needed. The landing gear, once extended, refused to retract, signaling irreversible consequences. For what felt like hours, the crew fought tooth and nail, using every ounce of their strength and knowledge to stabilize the plane. The gamble of relying on gravity to force the gear down paid off, albeit at great cost. Finally, after 15 harrowing minutes, the plane began to descend, albeit not smoothly, but enough for passengers to breathe once more. The once frantic cabin became a space of tense silence, with the steady descent signaling some semblance of hope. Yet, even that hope was fleeting. As they descended below 10,000 feet, the familiar lights of Tokyo loomed in the distance, sparking a fragile optimism in the cockpit. But as quickly as it had come, the captain's confidence was shattered. The plane banked hard to the left, throwing the crew into a renewed state of panic. The horizon blurred, and the realization sank in. This might be hopeless. The pilots, desperately fighting gravity and the will of their aircraft, continued to press forward, their instruments now mere echoes of their once steady routine. In those final moments, the once controlled flight devolved into a chaotic, desperate struggle for survival. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. The cockpit was filled with panic as the plane began its uncontrolled descent. The pilots, frantically trying to regain control, watched helplessly as the aircraft plummeted toward the mountains. With each passing second, the terrain loomed larger, closing in from beneath. The warning came too late, as the plane, Japan Airlines Flight 123, barreled toward the high terrain north of Mount Fuji. The voices of the crew echoed through the cockpit as they realized they were running out of time, desperately attempting to issue commands to avert disaster. In a desperate attempt to save the aircraft, they tried to make a sharp right turn, only to find the aircraft resistant to their efforts. The plane's autopilot had failed, leaving them powerless to stop the descent. Radar lost contact as the plane dropped below the mountainous terrain, cutting off all communication with Tokyo. Meanwhile, the pilots continued to fight against gravity, their determination pushing them to regain control. Yet, despite their efforts, the situation only worsened. The flaps, designed to stabilize the aircraft, malfunctioned, extending unevenly, which caused the plane to veer off course. The left wing, producing more lift due to the faster flaps, pulled the aircraft to the right. This imbalance worsened the situation, sending the plane spiraling downward at an alarming rate. Despite their exhausted state, the pilots refused to give up, their strength faltering but their determination unyielding. After more than 25 minutes of relentless struggle, they tried one last desperate maneuver, raising the nose and increasing power, hoping to climb out of the deadly dive. But fate had already decided. In a remote, unforgiving wilderness, the plane finally struck the mountainside. The next morning, rescuers discovered the tragic aftermath: 520 lives lost, making it the deadliest single plane crash in history. Among the wreckage, 4 survivors emerged, one of whom was Yumi Ochi, the off-duty flight attendant. Despite her injuries, Yumi spoke to investigators, her voice trembling as she recounted the explosion she had felt behind her. It was a clue that investigators would follow, leading to the discovery of a catastrophic decompression event. The fog had enveloped the aircraft, signaling the failure of the aircraft's integrity. The tragedy of Japan Airlines Flight 123 became a haunting reminder of between life and death. The events surrounding the tragic crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 unfolded with an air of mystery and mounting tension. As the flight attendants recounted their harrowing experience, they spoke of decompression and the sight of a gaping hole in the fuselage. This discovery immediately raised suspicion among investigators, who feared the worst: a bomb. The circumstances were eerily similar to 2 months prior, when a bomb had detonated at Narita Airport, coinciding with the tragic fall of another Air India flight off the coast of Ireland. International and Japanese authorities were already on high alert, fearing a coordinated terrorist plot targeting civilian aircraft. The focus on a bomb seemed logical at the time. The 747 aircraft was one of the most popular airliners in service, making any sign of fault particularly concerning. There was widespread concern that grounding these planes based on suspicion of bomb threats could have a devastating impact on global aviation. The investigators meticulously cataloged the wreckage, sending samples for explosive residue analysis, only to find nothing that conclusively indicated a bomb. Despite the lack of evidence, they couldn't rule out a bomb entirely. As the wreckage was examined in a hangar, the sight of the missing tail fin was especially troubling. Losing a vertical fin had never occurred on such a large airliner before. Yumio Chi, a survivor, described a hole in the rear of the aircraft, a detail that began to make sense as investigators pieced together the puzzle. Yet without the tail, they had no definitive proof. Days after the crash, part of the missing tail was discovered floating in Sagami Bay, raising hopes that it might provide the crucial evidence they needed. However, upon examination, it became clear there were no signs of fire or shrapnel damage, none of the typical indicators of a bomb. The rear door, initially suspected to have caused decompression, was found intact, further eliminating any explosive theory. This left investigators back at square one, with no trace of explosives and no concrete evidence pointing to a bomb. One thing became increasingly clear: something catastrophic had occurred in the rear of that plane, but it wasn't the result of a bomb. The search for answers continued, but the reality was undeniable. Flight 123 wasn't downed by a bomb. The investigators had been working tirelessly since the initial emergency call, piecing together every fragment of evidence to uncover the cause of Japan Airlines Flight 23's tragic crash. As they scrutinized the rear of the aircraft, a critical question loomed. Was there a structural flaw, a design issue, or something more fundamental that could have compromised the integrity of the plane? The need for answers became urgent. Every possibility, whether it was a structural defect or a series of overlooked design flaws, was considered. They couldn't ignore the alarming possibility that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger, systemic issue affecting all 747 aircraft. The Japanese government soon stepped in, calling for inspections of all 747 tail assemblies worldwide, reflecting the gravity of the situation. The safety of the entire fleet was now in question, and the implications were enormous. The thought of grounding the entire 747 fleet carried catastrophic economic consequences, especially for the United States, whose economy relied heavily on the production and operation of these aircraft. The tension was palpable, as the crash seemed to expose the vulnerabilities of a model that had long been seen as the backbone of aviation. Despite the looming 32-minute timeline from the emergency call to the crash, the investigation pressed forward, seeking crucial answers. The cockpit voice recorder became a critical source, playing back the last moments, revealing faint yet vital sounds. Among those were unsettling explosions, two distinct ones heard through the voice recorder. These explosions sent shockwaves through the investigation. The team wondered, if not a bomb, what had caused these abrupt and terrifying noises? As they dove deeper, the loss of hydraulics became a pivotal clue. The 747 had 4 hydraulic systems, essential for controlling flight surfaces like the rudder, elevators, ailerons, flaps, and landing gear. Without these systems, the pilots were rendered powerless, explaining their desperate and panicked transmission of uncontrollable to air traffic control. The search shifted focus to the aft section of the aircraft, where something wasn't adding up. The rear pressure bulkhead, a key component designed to contain cabin pressure, came under scrutiny. This bulkhead acted as a vital safety barrier, resembling a cork in a champagne bottle, keeping the cabin pressurized and stable. Its integrity was non-negotiable, especially under the immense pressure of flight at 24,000 feet, exerting more than 250,000 pounds of force. The thought of its failure seemed almost inconceivable, yet here they were, tasked with unraveling how it could have happened. Days of meticulous reconstruction led to a shocking discovery: a rupture along the bulkhead, running cleanly along a line of rivets, 41 inches long. It was unlike anything the investigators had seen before, a rupture that was far too neat, far too precise, far too sudden to be coincidental. The rupture suggested an explosive decompression, forcing investigators to confront an urgent question: what could have caused such a catastrophic failure? As they examined the piece of metal from the site, the evidence pointed to strange striations, lines etched in the metal, left behind by a force they couldn't yet explain. The investigators were drawn into this enigma, piecing together the puzzle that had brought down one of the most advanced aircraft of its time. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the answer lay hidden within the very structure of the plane itself. The crash wasn't just a tragic event, it was a call for answers that would challenge everything they thought they knew about aviation safety. A team of investigators delved into the mysterious failure that led to the catastrophic accident. They soon uncovered a complex web of radiating contours, subtle signs known as striations. These telltale marks indicated the gradual formation of cracks caused by metal fatigue, which had developed incrementally over time. Each pressurization cycle, each flight, exacerbated these small fractures, leaving faint yet persistent marks beneath the surface. The cracks began to form underneath the rivet heads, areas hidden from immediate view. Even when they became visible, they were minuscule, only a few millimeters long, making them almost imperceptible to the naked eye. The crack's origin could be traced back to the pressure bulkhead, a crucial component of the aircraft's structural integrity. These bulkheads were designed to withstand immense pressure, and any fatigue cracks in them posed a significant risk. Investigators found that these cracks had originated under the rivets, where they remained concealed. Despite being out of sight, the forces of repeated pressurization caused them to propagate, gradually weakening the structure. It became clear that the bulkhead was designed with a fail-safe system, a series of crack stoppers meant to prevent any single crack from spreading across multiple bays. However, something had gone wrong. Digging deeper into the aircraft's maintenance history, investigators uncovered a prior accident 7 years earlier in Osaka. That incident had left the pressure bulkhead severe to a hardtail strike during landing. Although the damage was extensive, Boeing engineers had opted for a partial repair, replacing only the lower half of the bulkhead instead of the entire section. The idea was that this repair would restore the structure to its original strength or even improve upon it. However, during the repair process, technicians had faced challenges aligning the upper and lower sections of the bulkhead. It appeared there wasn't enough overlap between the two, leading to a compromised connection. This subtle discrepancy, overlooked during the repair, had long-term consequences. The investigators discovered that the repair had used a single row of rivets instead of the required 2, which was supposed to hold the 2 sections together more securely. Further inspection revealed the use of 2 different splice plates, a clear indication of poor workmanship. The splice plates had been cut, possibly to facilitate easier installation, but this ultimately weakened the connection. The evidence suggested that the failure at this point wasn't merely a coincidence, but a direct result of the flawed repair. The cracks that had once remained hidden beneath the rivet heads had now spread, contributing to the catastrophic failure. The investigation had pieced together the puzzle, exposing the root cause, a combination of structural fatigue, poor maintenance, and a faulty repair that had compromised the aircraft's integrity. As the pieces fell into place, the full extent of the tragedy became clearer, one that had begun beneath layers of unseen cracks and rushed repairs. The investigation into the tragic crash of Flight 123 led to a groundbreaking discovery. The initial fatigue-related failure had set the stage for a devastating sequence of events. The lower plate had done its job, securing the overlap, while the upper plate had failed to hold, creating a gap that eventually led to the catastrophic collapse. A single roll of ribos was all that had been used, and it proved insufficient to bear the immense loads. The fatigue cracks that formed began a domino effect, culminating in the complete failure of the entire section. The fracture spread precisely along the gap between the two splice plates, a detail that could not be overlooked. The 747 SR aircraft in question had accumulated an astonishing 18,000 cycles over 12 years of service with Japan Airlines, JAL. Each takeoff and landing had subjected the structure to cycles of pressurization and deep depressurization, weakening critical components. The bulkhead had developed a weak spot, much like a ticking time bomb. This weakened structure could no longer hold, leading to the eventual detachment of the vertical tail. Investigators were certain that the improper repair was the root cause of this failure. They identified what they termed the golden nugget, the gap between the splice plates as the critical flaw. If repairs had been done correctly, the catastrophic decompression would not have occurred. However, the investigators still struggled to fully understand why the tail detached. The ruptured bulkhead could not simply disappear. All that pressurized air had to go somewhere. The shock wave surged up the tail, ultimately leading to the disintegration of the vertical tail, popping off like a champagne cork. The first boom marked the failure of the bulkhead, followed by the second as the tail section itself gave way. One of the most critical design flaws was revealed. Hydraulic lines running through the tail section were lost when decompression occurred. All 4 hydraulic lines ran up the vertical fin, leaving the aircraft without any hydraulic pressure to control the elevators, rudders, or ailerons. Flight 123 spiraled out of control, flying erratically for 32 minutes. Despite the pilot's desperate efforts to regain control, nothing worked. The hydraulic pressure was gone, and the flight became a nightmare of uncertainty. The initial repair that had seemed so innocuous 7 years earlier had set the stage for this tragic disaster. The aircraft was no longer capable of maintaining control, and the catastrophic loss of 520 lives became the worst single aircraft accident in history. The accident became a pivotal moment in aviation safety. It illuminated critical design flaws not only in the 747, but in the design of many other aircraft. The findings led to the implementation of new safety protocols, including the installation of hydraulic fuses and other mechanisms to prevent a total loss of hydraulic pressure. These changes have become standard practice in commercial aviation, ensuring that similar disasters are avoided in the future. The lessons from this tragedy continue to shape the future of aircraft design and safety.